The Hebrew Bible, or better known as the Old Testament, has a story in it. But it's not a random story. It actually leads somewhere. In fact, it leads to someone. It points us to Jesus. Now, along the way, God has put some road markers in that book. Some individuals who point us as signs to Jesus.
In the Apostle Paul's letter to the Galatians, he writes, God redeemed us in order that the blessing given to Abraham might come to the Gentiles through Christ Jesus, so that by faith we might receive the promise of the Spirit. John writes, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ.
Now we're standing here by the Tower of David, the Citadel of David. Frankly, this is not really from David's time, but because it is a high marker in Jerusalem, people said, oh, this must be the Tower of David. But it's a sign to remember that David established the city. In the same way, David established a key marker, pointing us to the Messiah. We often think of him as just a boy fighting a giant, but there's so much more to David. Everything about his life points in a direction, showing us who the Messiah will be. That's what we're going to look at. David on our journey to Jesus.
On this day of discovery with Michael Rydelnik, the unbreakable promise, God's covenant with David.
These are the shepherds' fields outside of the city of Bethlehem. For thousands of years, shepherds have brought their sheep here to graze, watched them, watered them. As you can see from the construction, the fields are getting smaller and smaller, and they won't be here very long. But they do remind us of a young shepherd who got his start right here, David, who later became king of Israel. Now, what happened was that Israel had a king, their first king, Saul, who had failed. And God decided it was time to establish who would be the next king, the one who would serve him better. And so he sends his prophet Samuel to the house of Jesse and says, Jesse, bring out your sons and I'll decide who will be the king. And God's directing Samuel to choose the one who would be king. One after another, the sons are brought out. They're all tall and handsome and strong, and they seem like they would be perfect to be king. But each of them were said not to be the ones that God chose. God says, no, 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 and then there's no sons left. And Samuel looks at Jesse and says, don't you have any other sons? He says, well, I've got this kid, he's out in the field, he's too young, he's just grazing the sheep. And the prophet Samuel says, bring him here. And he looks at him, and he did look young. He still had red cheeks. He was handsome, but really a kid. And this is the one the Lord said, choose him. He's got the right heart. The Bible calls him the one who had a heart after God, a man after God's own heart. He had the right heart. He wanted to serve God. And not only that, God had his heart. God chose him. And so David is the one that was anointed, and he would be the future king of Israel. There's much more to the story. Saul has many years as king, but David proves himself over and over again to be the one who has God's heart first, who chooses to serve God first, and he becomes the ideal king of Israel. We live in a time when we look at outward appearance above all. Are we thin enough? Are we good looking enough? Are we beautiful enough? You know, although that's nice, it's not what God looks at. When David was chosen as king, he was the youngest, he was the smallest of his brothers. He probably didn't look like what Samuel thought a king should look like. And God warned him. He said, no, man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. And David is the one who had the right heart. And therefore, Samuel anointed him as king. And the scriptures say, at that moment, the Spirit of the Lord took control of David. Isn't that amazing? God was going to empower him because of his heart. And at the very same time, the same passage, the very next verse, it says, the Spirit of the Lord had left Saul. Saul's heart of selfishness, his disobedience, had led God to remove his spirit from him, take away his power from him, and instead let it rest on David, whose heart was for the Lord.
For the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. 1 Samuel chapter 16.
This is the Valley of Elah. It's the actual place where one of the most famous stories in the Bible took place, the story of David fighting Goliath. Now, most people know the story about a young shepherd boy who comes and faces a Philistine giant who has been defying God's people. And he picks up 5 smooth stones in the dry riverbed over there, and he faces the giant, and he flings his stone on a slingshot, hits the giant, cuts off his head, and he becomes the hero of Israel. Most people know the story, but they fail to grasp the significance of this story. In fact, some people even talk about it, that it's just about how we face our giants, the giants in our lives, the troubles that we face. It really is much more than that. In this story, it sets up why David was anointed as king. Why was he the chosen one and not Saul? Well, the reason is when Israel first asked for a king, they said, we need someone who will be our champion, who will lead us in battle. And it would have been expected at this confrontation with the Philistines that it would have been Saul, the king of Israel, who would go out and face him. But Saul was too afraid. Instead, this young shepherd boy comes, and he wants to know, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he would challenge the armies of the living God? And then when he finally persuades his brothers and the army to let him go out and fight this Philistine giant, what he does is he shows why he is qualified to become king one day. He asks that question, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? And then he goes and faces him, and he says, you come against me with a dagger, spear, and sword, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel's armies. You have defied him. And then he says, the whole world will know when I've defeated you that Israel has a God. You see, David was much more concerned with God's reputation than he was with his own safety. It's not about how do you overcome a giant. It's this passage answers the question, who is qualified to serve God? And the answer is David was qualified. And in fact, anyone is qualified who is more concerned with God's reputation than anyone who is concerned with their own safety. That is the answer to the question, who are we concerned for? And as a result of that, David defeats the giant, and he's elevated as the hero of Israel, and one day will become king. He proves he's worthy of being king because he cares more about God's name than he does about his own security and safety. These are the springs of En-Gedi, an oasis in the wilderness of Judea. It's where people from Jerusalem would always flee if they needed to get out of town. There are caves for protection, there's water for drinking, and it's where David fled when Saul sought his life. David had become so popular as the well-known next king, as the leader of Israel's troops, that Saul pursued him. He became so jealous that he wanted to have him killed, and David had to flee the royal court. He came here and he gathered men, and he led them and went into the general area and protected Israel. But this is where David was fleeing from Saul. Now, David might have thought, I'm ready to be king already. I mean, I knew how to kill a bear or a lion in the wilderness to protect my sheep. What else does a king need to know? But actually, David really needed to learn lessons of character, lessons of leadership. And that's why God allowed this to happen, so that he could come off to the wilderness and learn lessons of how to lead men, of how to be compassionate towards others, of how to protect Israel, and also how not to act in vengeance. So David learned here how to be king. One might say that David had to learn to live life on the run so he could be able to sit on the throne. And this is David's college education for kingship.
He also chose David, his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds to shepherd Jacob, his people, and Israel, his inheritance. So he shepherded them according to the integrity of his heart, and guided them by the skillfulness of his hands. Psalm chapter 78.
This is the city of David. In fact, it is the uppermost part of the city of David, the site of one of the most extensive excavations in current Jerusalem. Now, when we look around, some archaeologists have noticed that there is a very large building at the top of the hill, at the top of the city of David. And also they found pottery from about 1000 BC. This has led archaeologist Eilat Mezar to conclude that this is David's palace. Now, we don't know for sure. There's no inscription, no marker saying this is David's palace, but it's likely that it was. Now, when we think about it, it reminds us of the story of David. David became king, and having become king, he settled, he gathered all the tribes of Israel under his reign. He ordered its borders, he dealt with the Philistines, and then he had cedars of Lebanon brought to this place, and he built a beautiful palace. And it says that once he was sitting in this palace, he thought to himself, here I am sitting with paneled cedar, and God's house does not have a permanent place. And that's when he determined that he would build a house for God. And David decides that he's going to take the part just above the city of David, Mount Moriah, and there build a temple for the Lord. This is the remarkable site of the city of David, where David first established himself as king over Israel. In 2 Samuel 7 in the Bible, it says that David had been given rest by God from all his enemies, so he's established the borders of Israel. Also, David has united all the 12 tribes under his leadership, and he has built a palace, a beautiful palace. And at this point, David's saying, you know, I'm doing okay, but the Lord needs to have a permanent dwelling for his house. Up until then, the Lord had there had been a tabernacle in which the people had worshiped the Lord, and David wanted to have the permanent site. And so he looked up just above the city, and as he looked above the city, he said, that's the place. I'm going to build a house for God. He told this to the prophet Nathan, and Nathan said, sure, go ahead, do it, sounds good. However, before long, within a day, the Lord spoke to Nathan and said, no, go back to David. His hands are full of blood. He's not the one that can build my house. And so God sent Nathan back and gave him a message. David, you won't build a house for me. Instead, the Lord said, I will build a house for you. The Lord declares to you, the Lord himself will make a house for you. When your time comes and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up after you your descendant, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. If he does wrong, I will discipline him with a human rod and with blows from others. But my faithful love will never leave him, as I removed it from Saul. I removed him from your way. David wanted to build a house for God. Instead, God says, I'm going to build a house for you. And he makes it really clear that this promise that he's making will be fulfilled by a descendant, that one day David would have a descendant who would build a house for God. Not only that, he promises that if David's descendant sins, that promise won't be taken away. The promise will be fulfilled by a descendant of David. And God will discipline the descendants of David, but he will never remove that promise as he did from Saul. Well, we can see this even in the life of David. David had great victories. He secured the land, he secured the borders, he secured the place. He even secured a place for the temple. But David's life didn't always go perfectly. After a while, when other kings went out to war, one season David decided to stay home. And while he stood at the top of the city of David looking down, you could see that there were other houses below, and he could see the rooftops. And there he saw beautiful Bathsheba taking a bath. And he lusted after her and brought her to his palace and slept with her. And she got pregnant. And then with this tragedy, David set it up for her husband to go to the front lines of a battle, to remove him from the picture. And when he was dead, he took her into his house as his wife. David's adultery was tragic, but what made it really tragic was this was the man after God's own heart, and he had failed. And we would think David really messed up so badly that God would take away the promise. But that can't be, because the covenant that God made was initiated by God. It was unconditional, and also it was unbreakable. God said to David, if you sin, or your son sins, or whoever sins in your line, I will never remove this promise from you. It is unconditional and unbreakable. I will raise up after you your descendant, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. Your house and kingdom will endure before me forever, and your throne will be established forever. When God gave his promise to David, he made a contract with David, an unconditional, unbreakable contract, a covenant. And he promised that David would have a descendant, and this descendant would last forever. He promised David that his descendant would have an eternal house. That means that the dynasty of David would last forever through this descendant. He promised David that this descendant would have an eternal kingdom. And that means that his people would last forever under this king. He also promised David that he would have an eternal throne. In other words, that David would have sovereignty, or David's son would have sovereignty forever. It's a very unique king that will last forever, that will have an eternal house, kingdom, and throne. It's surprising. We're thinking, who could this son be? David has this promise. He knows that one day he will have a special descendant, and this special descendant will be the one who is the king who lasts forever.
I have made a covenant with my chosen. I have sworn to my servant David. Your seed I will establish forever, and build up your throne to all generations. Psalm chapter 89.
This is the traditional site of David's tomb. Although it's probably not David's actual tomb, it's been venerated for hundreds of years as the place where David is buried. People still pray here. It reminds us that David died with a promise that his descendant would have an eternal house, kingdom, and throne. And as David received that promise, he expected his son, Solomon, to fulfill it. And as we read the text of the Bible, we think, oh, that's what's going to happen. That David's son, Solomon, will be the fulfillment of that promise, that he will have the eternal house, kingdom, and throne. And then God even says this to Solomon in the Bible. He says, as for this temple you are building, if you walk in my statutes, execute my ordinances, and keep all my commandments by walking in them, I will fulfill my promise to you, which I made to your father David. Solomon's told, if you will obey me perfectly, then you will be the fulfillment of that promise of the eternal house, kingdom, and throne. And we would almost believe that he is the fulfillment then. But as the story moves on, we hear more about Solomon. And then the writer of that book has us see the very next thing. Just a few chapters down the road, it says, King Solomon loved many foreign women, and he also adopted their gods. And so King Solomon, though the anticipated fulfillment of that promise, fails. And so, just as the promise said, if he sins, I will discipline him. Solomon was disciplined. But then perhaps his son would be the fulfillment. Well, we see all the line of David played out in the historical books of the Bible, 1st and 2nd Kings. And each king is measured against the ideal standard, and that's David. And it says, this king did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, like his father David. Or this king did what was wrong in the eyes of the Lord, unlike his father David. And they're all measured against David. But in the end, every king of Israel, every king of Judah, they all end up sinning. They all end up in failure. And so we come to the end of the story of the kings. The last king in the year 586 is taken in exile to Babylon. The nation is exiled, and the Davidic throne and the Davidic crown, David's crown and throne, are cast into the dust, and it looks like it's all over. The writers of those books want us to keep looking forward, that there would come a day when a son of David would return and establish that throne, that kingdom, and that nation, just as promised to King David many years earlier. The great longing and hope for the Jewish people throughout exile was for the restoration of the line of David, for the coming of the Son of David as promised to King David himself. And after years of waiting, longing, as Amos said, for the restoration of the fallen house of David, the fallen booth of David, and as Jeremiah had promised, for the sending of the branch of David to his people, finally, all this came to fruition on this long journey from the promise to David, when an angel came and talked to a young virgin, a Jewish girl, and told her she would give birth miraculously. And it was promised that she would conceive and give birth to a son, and you will call his name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. He will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end. Finally, that promise of a descendant with an eternal house, kingdom, and throne has found its fulfillment. It's in the life of Jesus of Nazareth, the one who was promised, the Son of David, who will reign forever.
For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end, upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with judgment and justice from that time forward, even forever. Isaiah chapter 9.
For the Israelites must live many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred pillar, and without ephod or household idols. Afterwards, the people of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come with awe to the Lord and to his goodness in the last days. This passage from the book of Hosea in the Bible says that the Jewish people, the Israelites, must live many days, and that refers to the time period that we're in even today. Many days without king or prince, no royalty among the Jewish people today. And also many days without sacrifice or sacred pillar. There are no sacrifices and no temple. And also many days without ephod, that's the garments worn by a priest, so no priesthood, or household idols, no idolatry. This describes the last 2,000 years for the Jewish people. It's the circumstances today. But then it says, afterwards, the people of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will look for David once again. Not David who died in the past, but David's greater son. David's son who was promised, who would have an eternal house, throne, kingdom. This is the David they will seek, and they will come with awe to the Lord and to his goodness. When? In the last days. This is a wonderful promise that says that though there are many days without these things that God had given his people, these great benefits, one day they will turn again to him. They will seek him, and they will find him when they seek the Son of David, the Messiah, who came and fulfilled the promise of having an eternal house, kingdom, and throne.
God made David their king. He testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. From this man's descendants, God has brought to Israel the Savior, Jesus, as he promised. Acts chapter 13.